Evidence: Chinese Communist Party satellites overhead Maui at the exact time of the DO attack. American Media Periscope.com. The Prather Brief, episode 92. Side note, remember Commander Thor told us that the attack on Maui was from the CCP, and it was from a CCP satellite. So we knew that right away, thanks to Commander Thor. The latest episode of the Prather Brief on AMP is an absolute bombshell with his guest, computer programmer and advanced robotics developer Steve Favis, who provides not only stunning evidence that indicates Chinese satellites caused the Maui fires, but also a simple and reproducible method for others to confirm his findings, and to then apply his method to investigate some of the other suspicious fires of the past, such as the Northern California wildfires of 2017 and 2018, and definitely look at Paradise, California, because that's one of the first noticeable DO attacks where houses just burned down and trees were left standing right next to the houses. So these DO attacks have been going on for a while, so it's good to go back and start looking with a different eye at all the wildfires. Steve tells Jeff that when people started claiming that Maui had been attacked by DOs, he wanted to determine if there had been something above Maui at the time of the fires. He used a commonly used science and engineering program called MathWorks MATLAB, which has a very accurate program called the SGP-4 Orbit Propagator. He found 2 orbiting objects that passed over Maui at around the same time that the 3 fires were initially reported. Then he backdated publicly available telemetry data from NORAD, which tracks all orbiting objects, and he found that there were 2 satellites that corresponded to the initial reports of 3 separate fires on Maui. Both objects are categorized by NORAD as unknown, with unknown payloads, and both unknown objects are owned by the Chinese Communist Party. 1 satellite's pass over Maui corresponded with the Lahaina fire, and the other satellite's pass over Maui corresponded with the Olinda fire, and then it orbited back along the same path 24 hours later, corresponding to the Kula fire. He says that if it were 1 satellite, that would be one thing, but when there are 2 satellites and 3 fires, and they're always above Maui, when these fires start, it's not an accident. Steve also mentions how just 3 days after the Maui fires started, on August 11th, Space Force launched its first targeting squadron, the 75th Intelligence Surveillance and Reconnaissance Squadron, which was activated out of Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado. Steve says he hopes this activation was in response to what he is convinced was a series of directed energy weapons attacks in Maui. Once again, we knew it was the CCP right away on this channel because Commander Thor gave us that intel. Steve says that he has open sourced his code on his website at mrrobots.com lasers, and he encourages people with access to MATLAB. A lot of universities use MATLAB, and he encourages people who are programmers to run his 25 lines of code, and they will be able to validate that the telemetry data is exactly what NORAD has posted on their SpaceTrack website. Steve says once you get the telemetry data and you input the data into the program and you convert the UTC time to local Hawaii time, they line up exactly at the same time that fires were reported. And he says you just need the Aerospace Toolbox, Aerospace plugins, and navigation plugin. You can just literally copy and paste his code into MATLAB. On his website, you'll see that he did the math for what it would take for lasers capable of melting cars and flash charring people's bodies into solid black sculptures like this. This was not a wildfire, folks. Of course not. Steve estimated that it would take a 70 gigawatt laser to do this. Not to mention people have video footage and there's photographs of these beams coming down through the smoke and everything and before. So that in itself tells you that it's a DO weapon. That's pretty self-explanatory right there. which would require a rocket that can launch a 44-ton payload into space, which lines up with China's Long March line of rockets, which have that payload capacity. Steve says Chinese lasers are currently more advanced than ours and that they're powering petawatt lasers in short bursts in the lab. A petawatt is a million billion watts. That's 15 zeros. When Steve pointed all of this out on Twitter, X, he was deplatformed because, of course, he was, because he was putting the truth out. Twitter is back to its old censoring self again. Now remember how back in January, the green lasers seen over Hawaii that were reported by the New York Post to be Chinese LiDAR scans for geospatial mapping of terrain. It is thought that this mapping may have been necessary in order to carry out successful DO attacks. And then we find out that a few months later, in April through June, the Army Corps of Engineers did their own LiDAR scans of Hawaii. And let's not forget the Chinese balloons that the Pentagon and the Biden regime were only too happy to allow to invade our airspace for a week earlier this year. So as Jeffrey Prather said, the question then becomes, with the green lasers from a Chinese satellite in January and the DoD's LiDAR scans between April and June, who could have been responsible for the DO weapons and the attacks? In Jeff's assessment, it appears the elements of the Department of Defense may have collaborated with China to do. It's the deep state, the globalists, whatever you want to call them, who control both militaries, or at least aspects of them.